The last time there were mass protests in China, it was back in 1989 in what was called the Tiananmen protests. It was led largely by young people, students from Beijing and Tsinghua universities who were asking for greater freedom. It culminated in the massacre of hundreds of citizens on the 4th of June, with the heavy hand of the Chinese state and the Communist Party coming down on the protesters in the most brutal fashion. Even today, any mention of June 4th is taboo in China. Authorities step up security and even monitoring on social media every year in June on the anniversary of Tiananmen. Today, 30 years later, there are mass protests across China, from Beijing to Shanghai, Wuhan, and other multiple cities across the country at a scale that we have not seen before. Hundreds of people took to the streets in both Beijing and Shanghai, the biggest cities, over the weekend to protest against China's zero-COVID policy. It was a rare outpouring of public anger against the state. China's hardline virus strategy is stoking public frustration. Many are growing sick and tired of snap lockdowns, lengthy quarantines, and mass testing campaigns. It all started with a deadly fire last week in Urumqi, which is the capital of northwest China's Xinjiang province. People who were stuck in that building, which had become a quarantine zone, as a result, firefighters were not able to reach them in time. Many got literally burned to death. This became a fresh catalyst for public anger, with many blaming lengthy lockdowns for hampering the rescue efforts. Authorities in Beijing and in Shanghai, though, deny these claims. On Crux DeCode, so is what we are seeing in China, across Beijing, Shanghai, and other cities, a repeat of what happened in 1989? What are the chances of this affecting China's supreme leader Xi Jinping or the ruling Communist Party? Will Western countries speak up against China's repression of these protests? The BBC said on Sunday the Chinese police had assaulted and detained one of their journalists covering the protests in Shanghai. He was released after several hours. The BBC said it had not been given a credible explanation for its journalist detention. Footage on social media showed Edward Lawrence being dragged to the ground in handcuffs, while he was seen saying in another video, "Call the consulate right now." A BBC spokesman, in fact, said that the BBC is extremely concerned about the treatment of its journalist Edward Lawrence, who was arrested and handcuffed while covering the protests in Shanghai. He was held for several hours before being released. The spokesperson also added that Edward Lawrence was an accredited journalist who was covering the protests in Shanghai. But that's not the only place where there were protests over the weekend. On Sunday night, at least 400 people gathered on the banks of the Liangma River in central Beijing. They were there for several hours. Some of the protesters were heard chanting, "We are all Xinjiang people, go Chinese people." AFP reporters at the scene described the crowd singing the national anthem and listening to speeches, while on the other side of the river, a line of police cars were waiting. Other vigils also took place overnight at universities across China, including the two biggest ones in Beijing, Tsinghua and Peking University. Speaking anonymously to foreign reporters, students of these two universities said that some anti-COVID slogans had been drawn on a wall inside the university campus. No to PCR tests and yes to freedom. That's what most students were heard shouting. Also, many students were heard shouting, "I want to go watch a movie." This slogan, in fact, became a rallying cry for young people who've been stuck with COVID lockdowns for the last 3 years now. Hundreds of people also gathered in downtown Shanghai. This happened Sunday afternoon to hold what appeared to be a silent protest. Demonstrators holding blank pieces of paper and white flowers stood silently at several intersections across Shanghai. Blank white papers have become the symbol of these protests. Many are calling it the A4 revolution, a measure of the size of paper that these protesters have been holding. Crowds have gathered hours before on nearby Wulumqi Street, which is a name for Urumqi in Mandarin. It had a video showing protesters chanting, "Xi Jinping, step down. CCP, step down." This was a rare display of public opposition to the Chinese Communist Party and its top leadership. The Shanghai protests were on in full swing up until 2 a.m., with one group mourning the 10 people who died in the fire in Urumqi, another group chanting slogans. And it's not just Beijing and Shanghai. In the central city of Wuhan, where the pandemic began 3 years ago, videos on social media showed hundreds of residents taking to the streets, smashing through police barricades, overturning COVID testing tents, and demanding an end to lockdowns. This is so far the biggest test for President Xi Jinping since he secured a historic third term in power earlier in October. The wave of civil disobedience is unprecedented in mainland China in the last decade. Since Xi Jinping came to power, this has been the biggest wave of protests across multiple cities at a scale that's not been witnessed in recent times. Widespread public protest is very rare in China because room for dissent has been all but eliminated under Xi Jinping. Citizens mostly vent their frustration on social media, where they play cat and mouse with state censors. China has stuck with Xi Jinping's zero COVID policy, even as much of the rest of the world has moved on. While low by global standards, China's COVID case numbers have been hitting record highs for the last few days, nearly 40,000 infections every single day in the country. Beijing has defended this policy as life-saving and necessary to prevent overwhelming the healthcare system. Now, these protests that we're seeing across major cities will put serious pressure on the Communist Party to respond and to be seen as responding. There is a good chance that one of the responses will be more repression. There will be arrests and prosecution of some of these protesters, which has always been the case with the Chinese state dealing with protests. Still, this particular unrest in 2022 is far removed from what was seen in 1989. Those protests culminated in the bloody crackdown in Tiananmen Square, right in the heart of Beijing. Remember, many of these young people today who are protesting have grown up in a China that has no memory of what happened in Tiananmen in 1989. They have lived in a China which has seen 30 years of unprecedented growth. Many of these young protesters would want that to continue. And also, many nationalist commentators on social media in China have already started pointing out conspiracy theories. They're spouting about how foreign forces are behind these protests. But the bottom line is this: as long as Xi Jinping and China's ruling elite have the military on their side, then they are not going to face any kind of meaningful risk to their grip on power. But having said that, China needs to seriously consider going easy on these restrictions, not least because of these protests, but also it has seen a historic low growth rate of just about 2.5% in a country which has taken pride in double-digit growth over the last 30 years, and if not, high single-digit growths. If the world's second largest economy is growing in low single digits, that is going to have a huge impact, not just on the immediate COVID lockdowns, but also on the overall China growth story going forward.